Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Amanda Brock. I'm the CEO at Open UK, and we're the UK organisation for the business of open technology. Welcome to the Open UK Summer of Open Source Security, and this is the third in our series of talks from guests across the pond. We have already had Kate Stewart talk to us about SBOMs and standards, Nicholas Chalin talking to us about making the Department of Defence secure. This week, it's my great pleasure to introduce Brian Bellendorf. Have I got that right? I wonder. I never say it right.
All good.
Brian, almost. Brian told me to describe him as an idealist. He's somebody who's worked for decades across open source and open technologies, promoting open source for the greater good as opposed to monetization of open source. He has a rich history with the Apache Foundation. He's worked with the World Economic Forum. He has worked for government. He's worked in startups, and he's had a couple of quite senior roles with the Linux Foundation in various guises, with Hyperledger, and now with the Open Source Security Forum. So with the Open Source Security Foundation, Brian's role has taken him back to the White House, where he's been working over the last year since the Biden ordinance, the White House ordinance on supply chain, with the White House. And I'm very grateful to him for joining us today to discuss a bit more about the work that OpenSSF has been doing. Brian, over to you.
Thank you, Amanda. It's really a pleasure to be here. I do have just a chunk of slides to get through that I hope helps set the context for a lot of what we're doing at OpenSSF and a little bit of how the open source community has evolved to where it's at today. And then we'll talk a bit about what we've done this year with the White House, but then kind of really open the door to a conversation I'm hoping to start regarding what we are doing with potentially other governments, other partners, and what more we could be doing with others, and in particular with you all in the UK. So why don't I just dive in straight to this? It's probably no surprise to this audience that we view at the OpenSSF and really the Linux Foundation that open source is at the heart of so much of the entirety of the software industry. Sonatype's State of the Software Supply Chain report from last year detailed that on average about 90% of a typical software stack, be that inside of a car or a phone or a doorknob or a drone or obviously web services and the like, is open source software, pre-existing open source that has been pulled in and perhaps modified, but largely used unmodified, but built on top of with the 10% creating actual value for the company doing that. And unfortunately, 29% of popular open source projects can include dependencies that have known vulnerabilities, things that have either not yet been remediated or where the downstream project simply hasn't updated its dependencies. Even of the ones that aren't popular, of the masses, almost 7% of those have known vulnerabilities that have not yet been remediated. So this is kind of a pervasive problem, and just to paint a picture for you of how we view the software supply chain, we view there as being this stream that goes from the developer and as they're writing code, kind of the what's in their head, and as they're transcribing it through an IDE or some other tool into a source code repository system, as that is handed off then to a build process to validate that they're actually building what they think they're building, and they're including in dependencies in that build, and then finally packaging it and shipping it off to the consumer. There's a whole lot of new opportunities for vulnerabilities to slip their way into that process that frankly were not anticipated at the dawn of the open source community, when we were largely a high trust environment. Lots of places where today we've seen examples of code review being bypassed, and the expectation we all have that open source code has been received the benefit of many eyeballs is not often true, especially when you see so many projects that are single developer projects. You sometimes have compromised source code control systems. You sometimes have code that's been modified after it's left the repository on its way to the build system. You have compromised build platforms. Sometimes you have as well, this has been a major issue, bad dependencies where developers, as they're typing in their IDE and they're including a certain library, they accidentally do a typo there and they get a valid hit thinking it's the right thing, and yet it's a clone of that piece of software that has, say, a cryptocurrency miner included in it, or some other nefarious type of application. to all the way to the tail end of that supply chain, the distribution points potentially being compromised. We see credentials, for example, of people publishing packages to NPM being compromised if they aren't using two-factor auth or other similar protections. So we have this pervasive problem that has existed throughout the open source landscape, which really, as the basis for the software supply chain, has meant that we've seen this explosion of breaches that you could describe really to these kind of weaknesses in the open source landscape. But where did they come from, and what kind of led us to this point where we have not just vulnerabilities in code, which we'll have forever. I mean, one of my favorite aphorisms is that the last software bug is fixed when the last user is dead. But how do we also end up in a spot where we've got bugs in the way that we're writing software in open source? And to do this, I want to travel a bit back in time to this is a screenshot from 1999 of a service called Netcraft, actually a company based in the UK, who from August of 1995 forward had been taking surveys of the entirety of the web. The web was a lot smaller in August of 1995. It was relatively easy to ping every IP address and query every host name and see, is there a website sitting behind that, and what server software are you running? And this survey would, even in those early days, pick up millions of sites and allow us to chart in very clear numbers the growth of the different software packages. And the Apache web server made a couple of very lucky moves early on, including the ability to support virtual hosts and some other things the commercial packages didn't pick up till later. And it was rather nice to be able to see this picture of open source software running behind all these different websites, right? Both volumetrically and in specifics. You could see, what software is running here, what software is running there. So being able to measure this spread of open source software, that was really the first time, I'll submit, that we had this easy, quantifiable, very public metric to put in front of people and say, look, it's actually being used. Certainly by 95, Linux was being used in domain name servers and print servers and in other kind of like, and web servers, of course. But it was hard to quantify because it was largely invisible. And even people who did surveys, they'd call, IBM famously did a survey in 99 where they asked their top 100 CIOs, are you using Linux? And 99 of them said no. And then they asked the technical team folks on the ground, and something like 80% of them said yes, because the CIO never saw a purchase order related to Linux. And so it was this like dark matter that finally Netcraft and others made visible. And it helped us make the case as open source developers that, to our bosses, so to speak, that open source could be trusted. And if it's good enough for both the CIA and the Vatican, both of whom you could see by going to their website, looking at the headers, we're running Apache, then it probably is good enough for us, right? And while this did help build trust and build a lot of traction for open source in general, Apache in particular, it also, when we made that argument, we were also implicitly making an argument that popularity is a proxy for security. You can trust it because so many other people are using it, and if there was a bug, it'd be found quickly, right? And I'll come back to that. The second step, though, in building this trust was showing that it really didn't depend upon heroics or personality to drive this success. That a lot of the early well-known open source packages, Apache, the Linux ecosystem, Perl, the Perl language, all of these developed contribution and project acceptance processes that favored community over code. This has been a mantra of the open source landscape for 20, 25 years, as not just the key to building higher quality software, being inclusive, trying to make sure everybody out there who had a bright idea and was willing to work towards it could be a part of the meritocracy that led to better quality code. The argument was that was part of making it secure as well. But something changed over the last 10, 15 years, but especially recently. The open source landscape has become a little bit something more like a swap meet, where or a marketplace. I don't know what the UK term might be for something like this, but where a whole lot of software projects are not associated with a foundation. They are not built by a community of people. They are instead built by single developers who put these things out as an artifact of some other process they're doing. Car boot sale. Thank you, Stephen. Basically, pushing this out, hoping other people use it, tremendously generous in offering the fruits of their work to the public. I don't want to discourage or discredit that, but single developer projects or two developer projects, and inevitably, not only does that lead to questions of sustainability and burnout and support and people feeling like they're getting nothing in return for what they're giving out there, but also leads potentially to security issues, because we know that security comes through the adoption of practices and policies and the like. And really, a lot of us are looking for, what was it about that barn raising kind of mentality? If any of you are not familiar, in the U.S. at least, part of our semantic landscape is the Amish doing these barn raisings once in a while, when a farmer is trying to build a barn and they need help to raise the beams and put the structure in place, and the things that a single farmer can't do on their own. The idea is the whole village gets together, helps them accomplish that thing, and then each person brings a unique set of skills and that sort of thing, right? And this, frankly, is a better metaphor and the kind of open source community that tends to lead to better quality software, higher security practices, and when we think about the deep, rich nesting hierarchy these days of software, where a package like Kubernetes includes, especially in a couple orders down, I think it's 4,000 different external software packages are included inside of this one thing we know of as Kubernetes. We better hope that each of those nested kind of dependencies and the projects around them are essentially barn raisings all the way down. And they're often not. So what we realized, I think, over the last 25 years is that the open source software community was really one of the first places on the internet that demonstrated, with the right processes, you could handle contributions from anonymous or pseudonymous sources, right? This was really key to our scale, to the enough eyeballs kind of point. And now, these days, I'd argue we're one of the last such places. I think it's basically open source projects in the Wikipedia, which credibly, arguably, could say, we've been able to tap this kind of thing without needing a whole lot of drill down into who that individual is to be able to accept their contribution. And last May, I was testifying to a House subcommittee on science and technology panel who were investigating the Log4j breach, disclosure, whatever you want to call it. And they had lots of questions about how open source worked, how the security in that worked. And Congressman Perlmutter asked me, how do you keep bad code from the Chinese or from the Russians out of something like Linux or Apache? And so my response to him was to note that last year, the University of Minnesota, as a research project, attempted to demonstrate that you could introduce intentional vulnerabilities, backdoors into even high-profile open source projects through social engineering, by slipping it in, and that there weren't enough rigorous processes. Well, they failed. The patch came in. It did go a couple of steps through the acceptance process in the Linux kernel until it was noticed that, this patch does things other than claimed. People started asking questions, realized this was a research project that somehow had passed the kind of standards and practices of the university. From that point forward, the university, till today, and presumably beyond, the University of Minnesota has been banned from contributing to the Linux kernel project. I relayed this and said, look, so far we've been able to survive based on these kinds of quality control processes and the social processes that do not depend upon people having to badge in, show their passport, et cetera, to be able to demonstrate that their code contributions are quality. But this is a little weak, to be honest, because it's a little like that standard picture of survivor bias, which is, here's the parts on the plane where the bullet holes appeared on the planes that survived and came back to the airfield. We know about the ones we've caught. We don't know about the ones we haven't, right? And most of the time, we're not worried about the intentional compromises, but even the unintentional bugs are greater than we'd like to see. And so what do we really need to do to improve how we're building code in the open source world? Well, from the point of view of many of us, I think we need to move from ad hoc securities to more systemic improvements. And to do that, we need better tools to measure the trustworthiness of code based on more objective measures, right? Being able to scrutinize a patch line by line is something we did in the early days, and that's just not possible with pull requests that pull in major chunks of code and the volume of changes we see on certainly the active projects these days. We need processes that encourage better security practices by developers, more belt and suspenders kinds of approaches to make sure that, even if developers are coming into a project with a really, really wide array of different experiences, different levels of training, that sort of thing, that the processes themselves help guard against lesser quality code making their way in. We need tools and processes that encourage teamwork as well, going back to the barn raising metaphor, and shared responsibility, not just for quality and community management and all those kinds of things, but for security as well. And finally, we need to add by default to all of the above and bake these kinds of tools and processes and kind of cultural nudges into the standard tools and processes developers use today to build code. And so this hopefully gives a bit of a framework for what the OpenSSF is doing to try to, across what is frankly, I lovingly call it a circus. You could call it a garden if you'd like, but it is a wide array of different working groups, initiatives, projects, all under the banner of the OpenSSF. All of these things were grassroots. All of them were things that people felt were important and brought in. The Linux Foundation plays a role in kind of convening this group, giving it a structure. Having a membership structure that helps fund some of the supportive staff and infrastructure to make these things work, and the governance processes to help make sure everybody's time is well spent and we're able to produce things that we're happy with. But everything from the education and best practices and other types of guides developed into the best practices working group to the work of the vulnerability disclosures working group, which is focused on helping open source projects get better at managing when they get a bug, as the Log4j developers did, that is pretty severe. How do they manage a coordinated disclosure process? To securing critical projects working group, which is focused on how do we identify the most critical projects and make sure that they're getting the attention that they need, to the supply chain integrity working group, which is focused on across this chain, how do you provide communication, levels of attestation that might be informative to as you go further down the chain, to knowing where code came from, the degree of diligence that was put into verifying the build, those sorts of things that are actually essential to a DevSecOps process. This is a specification for doing that and some supportive software for it. To important projects like SigStore, which are all about signing software artifacts as they flow through this chain. Happy to go into more depth on that, but that wasn't really the focus for my talk. Partly what it is the bottoms up work that now with the mobilization plan, we would like to meet top down. So let me give a little bit of the background on this. Last December, Log4Shell hit the internet, and I do want to be clear, I hate calling it the Log4j problem, because Log4j is the name of a project that has some remarkably smart people, that's pervasive. They got there because of their hard work. Log4Shell is the compromise, and it kills me every time I hear the public media say Log4j, as the name of the problem. But anyways, Log4Shell breaks the internet. Everyone gets concerned, and some important people start asking questions like, does this indicate a more pervasive, deeper problem in the way that the open source community works? Is it related to supply chain issues? Is it related to the diligence that open source projects use when they build code? And is this the new normal? Should we just expect that once a quarter, once a year, there's going to be an earthquake like this that we all have to recover from, which makes it awfully hard to figure out how to really depend upon this stuff? And some of those people asking that question included the National Security Council at the White House, who convened a conversation in January with 10 large open source and cloud infrastructure companies, the usual suspects, the Microsofts, Googles, et cetera, along with the Linux Foundation / OpenSSF, us, and the Apache Software Foundation. And the question that they posed, that Ann Neuberger's team at the National Security Council posed, was, is this normal? And if it's not, what are you all doing to fix this? And are you coming up with ideas, or are you actually moving to solve these issues, right? And we kind of, over the course of those hours, just try to steer everybody towards identifying kind of three overarching goals that we might have as we try to fix these things. It's not just about making the development of open source software more secure by default, which I think there's a lot that we can do there. It's also about improving the pace at which vulnerabilities are discovered and successfully remediated. Part of the problem with the log4j bug with log4shell was that the remediation process was rather haphazard and chaotic, and that led to scrambles, particularly over people's winter breaks, that cost a lot more than they probably needed to. And then finally, how do we shorten the time that it takes for improvements to get out there? Some of you may have recalled that a lot of organizations and even other open source projects proudly proclaims that, don't worry, we're not vulnerable to log4shell because we're still using log4j 1.x. Well, log4j 1.x had not been supported at all with any improvements, even security fixes, for 5 years. And so that wasn't something to be proud of. That was something to be embarrassed by. How do we fix this, right? How do we go about and actually try to address this and meet the bottoms up stuff, which we hope people use in OpenSSF, with a little bit more of a top-down mandate? In response to that meeting, a bunch of us went away and said, right, how do we take this great stuff being offered opportunistically and drive a set of processes that could make a double-digit % impact in some reasonable time to go and solve these, right? And so we broke up inside the OpenSSF community into 10 separate teams with a whole lot of overlap of individuals, of course, but along 10 different themes that we kind of identified both in that January meeting and kind of coming out of that. And within each of these 10 aligned roughly under these 3 goals. What are some existing efforts, either at OpenSSF today or not, that we could build on top of to address these? What are some specific targets that we could set in the 1 or 2 year horizon that are both ambitious but pragmatic, that don't require inventing a whole new thing, whole cloth, that don't require trying something that hasn't been done before, that ideally is shovel ready is the term, that a lot of us like to work with government. When a new administration comes in, they want to have a big impact quickly. They want to look for the things that are ready just to pour money at. What are the things that are ready for that? And to do this in an era that said not that money is no object, right? Not that we could spend billions to do this, although we did kind of caution in that meeting in January, this might cost billions of dollars to fix, to actually implement it, and it's hard for any one company to just proactively put that in. But to say, what would it take from a resource perspective, from a lean perspective, assuming lots of volunteer help, what would it take to actually solve this? And so we put together this document as a result of those 10 streams of work that we called the Open Source Software Security Mobilization Plan. And it outlined, and this is really a first of its kind for the Linux Foundation at all, certainly for OpenSSF. Because so much of the time we're used to the meritocracy, the bottoms up, the opportunism, the kind of the happenstance. We create the structure, and if people show up to that structure and start creating good things and adopt it, great. But generally speaking, we don't do these top down kinds of things. But I think the times call for it. The questions that we received from certain parties called for this kind of thing, and so we jumped in and again, working with our community, not what Brian thinks, but what our community thinks needs to be done. We identified about $150 million worth of fundable opportunities that we think would make major dents in each of these 10 different places. And I'm going to spare you all kind of too much depth on that because the document is out there, but I thought it would be useful to kind of go into kind of a high level view of each of them. And spend 20 seconds on each. So the first of those 10 is focused on security education. How do we just help developers have a better starting point to understand how to build code that is less likely to lead to software vulnerabilities? We already in the OpenSSF have created training materials that we've had over 10,000 people take on secure software development fundamentals. We are adding materials to that to detail how to use SigStore, detail how to do DevSecOps, detail all sorts of additional kinds of add-ons on that. But just thinking about the baseline software, the bottom of the pyramid, if you want to think about that, how do we get the vast majority of people who are writing software today to take that course or courses like it? And so Stream 1 is focused on doing that within the first 2 years. Stream 2 is focused on saying, right, We know that there are a bunch of objective tools out there, and I didn't get a chance to talk about some of the ones at OpenSSF, but they include the best practices badge, something we have that called the security scorecard, which is kind of a scanning tool, a couple of other things that are in development, as well as some external reference points. That what we'd like to do is pull that in to a single dashboard, a single kind of view, where you could say, right, I'm looking for a logging framework for Java applications. I can identify three of them. Where do each of those three measure up on these objective measures? And to help people make choices that at least are somewhat grounded in security practices that don't guarantee that there's no bugs, but are reasonable assessments that there might be fewer bugs in one versus the other. And even if that one had fewer features, it might be smarter to use that than the one that doesn't score as well on some of these proactive measures. So what would it take to actually build that kind of infrastructure and make that a public resource for everybody who's consuming open source code, but also as a benefit for developers to understand where they might improve their score and be better on those fronts. The third stream focuses on how do we make digital signatures much more pervasive across the software supply chain. How do we get more of the upstream modules to be signed as they get handed off, and do this in an approach called SigStore that uses basically as a lighter touch way of assigning and provisioning keys for those signatures in the same way that Let's Encrypt made using SSL or TLS behind websites much easier for people than before they existed. A fourth stream is one that's actually not something that's happening at OpenSSF yet, but happening in a different part of the Linux Foundation, which is focusing on taking a couple of really core libraries and core network services that today are predominantly implemented in C, C++, or the like, and rewriting those or investing into the existing rewrites of those into a memory-safe language called Rust. And in doing that, eliminating entire categories of potential vulnerabilities through the improper memory handling that is all too easy to do inadvertently in the C programming language. Go is also a memory-safe language. Even Java is a memory-safe language, but Rust has really emerged as the right one for systems-level programming when performance is a primary consideration. And so this is a very specifically targeted type of stream. Pulling back up a bit, Stream 5 is focused on incident response. How do we help under-resourced open source projects in particular, those who don't have security teams from an organization like the LF or the Apache Foundation or others, who can jump in when a vulnerability is discovered and help that small team understand what's the best next step. How do you develop a patch that actually addresses that? So there's some domain expertise called for, but also how do you coordinate with CERT or some other naming authority to get a CVE? How do you coordinate with your major stakeholders to get perhaps an update pushed to them before it's publicly known? How do you even commit the fix to your repository without flagging all the people today who watch commit messages to look for CVE numbers or for other signs that you're closing a big hole? In fact, that was one other thing that caused the Log4j release to be inadvertently such a scramble, the fix to be such a scramble, because the commit that was made referenced to CVE number, which it was an honest mistake. It was inadvertent, but that's what suddenly caused this to grow beyond what people realized. So Stream 5 is to help resource a team that can be provisioned to go in and do those things. Stream 6 is really focused on better scanning. How do we systematically apply new research in looking for new classes of vulnerabilities or when a vulnerability is discovered that seems to use a novel technique? How do we apply that systematically to perhaps the top 10,000 open source projects out there to see who else is vulnerable to, again, using Log4j as an example, to these Jindy LDAP kinds of compromises, right? If we can boil that down to a query that could be sent to CodeQL or through one of the other types of security scanning tools, and then we provision the infrastructure to do that on a regular basis, and when we find something, work with the upstream community to get that fixed, again through a proper process, a very careful process. What would it take to do that well? And that was the focus of 6. Stream 7 really focuses on code audits. This is something that anyone who's participated in one of these with an open source project knows can be a little tough. It's always awkward to have experts, come in and scrutinize not only for the off by one error that could lead to the memory vulnerability, that could lead to the compromise, but also to really challenge your architecture, to really challenge your assumptions, perhaps even some of the features that you as a developer have provided to your users. And to ask, did you really mean to put this chainsaw in the middle of a dinner cutlery set? Because your users might not realize the kind of sharp edges that are on that thing when they go to use it, or what that red button does. So that's what a proper code audit does. These are not cheap. These cost, including working with the upstream community, including remediation, for an average project on the order of $200,000. And so to do 200 of them a year is a $40 million nut, right? But we believe the positive impact that can come from that it far exceeds the cost of doing those on any given component. Stream 8 is really focused on helping answer this question, which today is hard to answer, which is, what are the most critical open source projects? Everybody's got an opinion. Everyone, has the ones they use, and then, they might be aware of dependencies further down. But getting systematic about this requires engaging with folks who are at the major distribution points for software, as well as those software composition analysis tools vendors, the people who build tools that enterprises run, to look at their own infrastructures and go, we're using X and not Y, to really get an understanding of usage out there. Might also involve putting telemetry in some places, which is also an extraordinarily fraught thing to do, but one that we think is important to be able to figure out. How do you really objectively try to find that small little component that has a halftime person maybe volunteering on it, and that XKCD comic, the one that if you kick that out, everything else collapses, right? We've already published work at the OpenSSF in conjunction with Harvard that defines a criticality score for so many open source projects. But even just doing that on a yearly basis for a subset of the potential data is extremely challenging. We'd like to make that much more frequently updating and something that encompasses a larger data set. Two more, hang in there. Stream 9 is about taking the work that's been done on software bill of materials. You heard from Kate talking about what they are and why they're important. Well, one very important thing, I'm sure Kate impressed, is we'd like to see SBOMs published as far upstream as possible, right? We want to make sure that publishing of an SBOM is as standard and routine in open source projects as publishing your license on your software. And make that built into the tools, perhaps built into Make and built into Java-C, built into the kind of compiling and development tools that are there that everyone uses, the IDEs as well. Only by doing that do we actually get to the point where SBOMs become a matter of public record, so to speak, rather than left to the last mile, where, because they'll be hard to assemble, the vendors who deliver the last mile will view them as a proprietary advantage, right? We'll view them as, well, we worked hard to build this, we're going to lock this down. So to everybody's interest, particularly governments that are starting to mandate this, we believe we need to invest in tooling, and we believe the SPDX format is really the right way to go with this, particularly given its alignment with licensing. Invest in tooling to add this functionality to the major development tools out there, and then push for their adoption. Finally, we believe that those last mile participants in the supply chain have a really critical role to play in helping. Look, they're like the app stores, right? They're, and anybody who knows what Apple does and Google does in their App Store and Play Store know that they are often the guarantors of security for the end users, right? And there's a lot that we believe they could do to provide better data about security characteristics, perhaps highlight or promote within their infrastructure those packages that have better security practices, but even requiring publishers to simply use two-factor auth, for example, which many of them have started to do. NPM recently announced that they'll be requiring two-factor auth for the publishers of their top 200 modules, for example. Even all those improved practices lead to better security for the tail end. And so there's a lot of hard work behind what's been detailed here, and we're really, and we already have convened the product managers and security experts behind those major distribution points, NPM, PyPy, Rust crates, and a couple of others in a working group at the OpenSSF to start that work. So putting all this together across those 10 streams is where we got to the roughly $150 million. I don't want to oversell the specificity of the work that we've done here. This was intended to take us to a 3 to 5 pager, one level deeper than the headline paragraph, perhaps, that I've shown you here and is at the beginning of the document. These are living plans, though. They are expected to evolve over time. In fact, even this plan, we labeled it version 0.9.1 to kind of, just get across our belief that this is a work in progress. This is a flagpole at a moment of time, but each of these different streams now have started to move on to refining their plans and working to identify specific funding opportunities to go and start to flesh out those plans. We launched this in May at basically a sequel to the meeting from January. The National Security Council and Neuberger's staff asked us to be the convener this time. So we invited, of course, them and all the other folks from different government agencies, CISA, ONCD, the Department of Energy, all sorts of other places to participate in the work that in this meeting, along with those same 10 companies that came before, but a set of additional companies, and then representatives of some of the major open source projects to come to DC, to spend time with us there, to review the plan and even drill down a little bit more into some of the details, but ultimately not to go and ask them for funding. This was an important thing. And I know every government approaches this differently, and, in a different setting, maybe there would be a slush fund available to be able to put into initiatives like this. In fact, it sounds like there might be some work in a current bill that hasn't yet passed, which would fund general purpose improvements in the open source software and the software supply chain. But it wasn't to go specifically and say, hey, government, can you give us a $150 million check and we'll run. It was instead to say, as you do work in this domain, and CISA in particular have done quite a bit, and as they're open up certain funding opportunities across different parts of the federal government, we'd like you all to be aware of what we in the private sector are doing and align efforts as much as we can. And unexpectedly, our members who had participated in the drafting of the plan said, "This is such there's such quality already in the thinking that's going on here and in the commitment and the drive. We'd like to bolster that by putting a little bit of funds towards that." And so we received $30 million in initial pledges from Amazon, Ericsson, Google, Intel, Microsoft, and VMware. Collectively, in fact, Amazon said they'll put in 10 of that 30 to this plan. And we announced that, and we're starting to set up structures to be able to go and claim those funds for those different streams and get started on them individually. Again, this is a plan, but it's this awkward kind of thing of the top down meeting the bottoms up, right? And so we're definitely in the process now of figuring out how to make that work. Finally, about the number 150, to folks who have participated in open source projects, that's a large number. That's an order of magnitude and a half larger than the current OpenSSF budget. It's something that I don't know of any open source project that has a yearly budget at that scale, any individual open source project, but it's very reasonable when you compare it against just one other data point out there, a $700 million number. And if those of you don't immediately recognize what that number might be attached to, that was the fine that the Federal Trade Commission levied on Equifax for the 2017 data breach caused in part by unpatched open source code, Apache Struts. And the FTC further sent out a notice back in February, I believe it was, that in addition to fines that they would levy for data breaches by companies anyways, they would top those fines up further if they discovered that that organization had not patched all their instances of Log4j, even if those instances were not directly involved in the data breach. And so while we're all focusing on carrots over here to try to help the open source community improve and corporations improve in their use of open source code and be more secure, there's also a whole lot of sticks that are coming as well to try to bring the laggards up at the very least. And so in that context, and this is my last slide, We're so as I mentioned, we're putting up together special interest groups to advance each of those streams, both the plan and then to prepare proposals for funding in line with those plans. We'll be convening a series of funding meetings on a monthly or more basis to bring pledging organizations together to review and to fund these proposals. You could call it Shark Tank, as kind of a metaphor. These organizations wanted to still be in the driver's seat to express their own kind of priorities on which of the specific streams are more fundable than others, or which proposals are more mature than others. But at the same time, we felt we needed public scrutiny and public input into the development of how those proposals help further each of the streams of the plan. We'd love to have all sorts of other organizations in those meetings. They are designed for the organizations that have made a public pledge and said, we believe this is important enough that we anticipate putting in, $1 million at least over the course of the next 2 years into funding this work. But frankly, those organizations could be nonprofits, they could be co-ops, they could be folks making it, they could be venture capital, that don't quite offer any equity in return, sadly, but they're in an interesting ecosystem position as well, and that could be interesting. And frankly, there are some governments who view themselves as investors in systematic kinds of improvements like this. The U.S. government will see if something materializes directly on that. Frankly, they have been helpful, and they could be very helpful even in a more orthogonal way. But we have conversations already ongoing with folks in certain countries in Asia to make that possible. We know that there are, we followed what's gone on in the European Union from the French presidency to the Czech presidency now, and then on to the Swedish presidency later in next year, where funding for this kind of work is becoming more and more of a topic of conversation at policymaker levels. And then, it would be interesting to see. I know funding picture might be unclear, especially given looming recessions and the like, and the cost of energy at this point and those sorts of things. But certainly open to seeing where this might line up with the ways the UK government views investments into public sector, into improvements in this that benefit everybody globally. So that's kind of our hope. And even if all we do is find a way to align our efforts with other parallel efforts going on that are funded by others, we'd really love to see this be a guide to how top down we can go and close up a lot of the major deficiencies in how we write software across the world today. So with that, thanks. That's a link to the mobilization plan, but frankly, just openssf.org will show you that, plus all the other great stuff that's happening, and would really be eager to have all of you participating in some level, even without any discussion of money, any check being written. There are innumerable opportunities to both use the fruits of the work coming from the OpenSSF community. So please come and check out and see if there's something useful there for your organizations. And if you believe in something, you believe you'd like to help us advance something, even entirely on a non-monetary basis, there's lots of opportunities to volunteer and be a part of having an impact. So thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Open UK. Let's see if there's some questions now.
That was really great. Can you hear me okay?
I see the question from Bjorn. Between Jan and 30 June, Sweden will be the chair of the EU. What message and which of the 10 streams would you suggest they push specifically? And noting as well that Ericsson was one of the companies mentioned on the slide. I don't know. I don't know which of the 10 streams is more of interest, either specifically to the Swedes or the European Union, or even in general, which of those streams are more suitable for public policy than the others. I mean, I could go through each of the streams and I could find a way to describe, look, stream one is about education, right? The state has a major role in educating its workforces. In fact, just yesterday, there was a major meeting at the White House on the education and training required for the cybersecurity sector of tomorrow. I mean, even of today, it's short millions of people for the positions that are already open. So how do we go about training both the broad and the deep on cybersecurity, and in particular on software supply chain issues and open source issues. Well, that's why my boss was at that meeting. Jim Zemlin was at that meeting, and participating in those conversations to try to say we've got these opportunities, we've got this ready-made, shovel-ready kind of opportunities. So that's just the first. In every other thing, more or less, like maybe less on the digital signatures. Maybe that's something they expect more of us to do, although, they care quite a bit about digital signatures and identity. I would love to also see, and there's a tendency, I think, amongst regulators and amongst government to lean in a direction to say, well, I can't just trust the internet. I can't just trust the world. I can't trust anybody who shows up. I've got to really scrutinize who they are. And we see this in know your customer laws in finance, for example, which I think are appropriate and very well intended. And there are a lot of bad actors out there whose use of the financial systems would be unfortunate. But I think it would be also unfortunate to have a know your developer, or kind of to focus too much scrutiny on who the individual contributors are to open source as a proxy for trying to measure the trustworthiness of that code. And so I'd love to partner with governments to figure out what are the other ways that we can apply tooling and processes to help you gain a greater degree of trust in code for mission critical purposes, for critical infrastructure purposes, right? To the point where I hope you can focus more on those objective qualities of code and process and less on what was the IP address or claimed nationality of the contributor to that code. Because I can tell you there's nobody who badges in to submit a patch to the Linux kernel with their national ID or passport, right? We're not going to be able to keep Chinese, Russian, even North Koreans from contributing to major open source projects because they all know how to use VPNs. There's really no sneaky way to try to slip that in. This is where I sense perhaps the greatest distance right now between some of what I hear in policymaking circles and the reality on the ground. So anything that we can do to help win confidence on the part of government and policymakers in the processes and the tools and the way that we build code, and objectively actually build better code because of it, and keep intentional attempts at a subterfuge out of these projects, the better.
Brian, that's really fascinating because it's the same old story where this is an obvious issue for open source, an obvious challenge, but actually, again, it's a software issue. It's not specific to open source. So when governments look at where the code comes from, they don't know this when they're looking at proprietary code either, even although it's coming from maybe a single source, that single aggregator of content across their employees, across their contributors. Because the reality is that all software is built collectively these days. Nobody sits down and writes a whole package themselves or a whole piece of infrastructure software themselves. So we're seeing this big shift to looking at open source. But of course, we've been working on this open source governance for a long, long time. And you mentioned earlier gatekeeping and good gatekeeping and bringing the standard of projects up. And then, of course, education to help with that. It's an absolutely enormous task that you've described today. So if you were talking to the UK government or the Swedish government, where our friend Bjorn is, what would you say is the starting point for them? Where do you begin this process?
So the convening we had in DC, first off, it was great to have that first meeting where we could better understand why the National Security Council viewed this as a priority, what CISA and ONCD were doing on this front already. I mean, back to the executive order on SBOMs last year, they've been thinking about many of these related issues. So first off, understanding what level of competency they're at or what level of where their interests lie first would be very helpful. And that's where either a meeting one-on-one between us and them, or in a kind of a small group, with a set of their major stakeholders, their own vendors, their own national organizations, it would be productive. At such a meeting, we'd be happy to talk about the state of the landscape as we see it, the circuits that we've built around OpenSSF to start to address this, but not to get into too many technical details, but then to talk about the plan and the validation of that plan by the organizations that have helped draft it and have signed off on it and said this is goodness, right? And those kinds of conversations, I'm happy to jump on a plane to go and have, of course, but also there's a lot of work that we can do just through conversation and it often, if it leads to some sort of white paper, leads to some sort of position paper, that's a way to concretize it. And
Yeah.
then the second thing is, I'm sure you've talked a lot about open source program offices, OSPOs, right? The French presidency set up an OSPO, as I understand it, as part of when they were in the EU presidency, and endowed it with $40 million to go and do some of the hard work in helping the French government be smarter consumers of open source code. And so if we can find a similar organization inside of the Swedish presidency, inside of the Swedish government, or in the inside of the European Union, to act as this kind of center of competency around open source use, they're also ones who are in a great position to be able to set security standards for the work that they create and the open source projects they consume, which would be a positive force in this place. And then finally, maybe that also comes with a pocket of funds that they could put towards some of these initiatives.
So when you say a pocket of funds, are you offering them funding, or you're asking for funding from them?
As I think we've shown a target-rich environment that for which we've identified some funding and are starting work on, and hopefully identifying more.
Right.
These are, but we don't have the full 150 funded, and
Okay.
even as we get started, we're going to identify more that I think if we make the case that these are lean efforts that have measurable impact, for those funders, that's going to be a compelling offer. So yeah, I think the ratio of funds to clue is going to be higher amongst government folks than those of us working in the trenches here on this, and so we'd like to make the connection with them.
And we've been discussing an event that Open UK will be hosting on the 20th of September in London. Now, that date may change slightly, but we believe it's going to be the 20th of September. And we hope to be doing that in partnership with the team at OpenSSF, with others across various foundations in the UK, various UK organisations. And importantly, we hope to bring DCMS, UK government and the devolved nations into that discussion as a kickoff for the cross collaboration between the open source communities, enterprise and UK government to start to discuss how we take this forward as a group. That follows hot on the heels of another event that our colleagues in Europe are having. Open Forum Europe are hosting an event on the 16th of September with the Czech presidency. I'm not sure it's quite as targeted. Our event is going to look at infrastructure, curation and security. I think those is a slightly broader remit, but I think they're all good evidence of the start of this in Europe, across Europe, whether the EU or the UK, and look forward to working with you, Brian, on all of this. If you were giving us any advice other than collaborating with OpenSSF, which we're already hoping to do and starting, what advice would you give us in this engagement with governments?
Well, and looking at Bjorn's comment there about hearing a lot of misconceptions of open source, I think there is still a lot of education to do with parties in government, and it's wise to think about where are the points where we can educate them and have that retained beyond the current administration, right? I've seen, I worked in DC 2009, 2010, where I don't think you could say there was anybody on the federal payroll who had ever been a Python developer. And now we've got organizations inside the federal government in the United States, like USDS and 18F and others, who are starting to help government as a whole be smarter about open source. I mentioned OSPOs, that's another structure. But even when I was taking questions from lawmakers on May 11th, it was clear that some of those lawmakers themselves were former programmers, and their staffs were very smart about prepping them with appropriate questions. So I think there's just a raw educational function that's necessary here about the broad strokes, the specifics at times, and the opportunities to turn financial resources into impact in a lean way. And so I'm signed up for that. I assume that's a lot of what Open UK does as well. And we have to not discount that or get discouraged by how much education work we have to do. And any other creative approaches we can take, I'm signed up, and I will be at both those events that you mentioned, and happy to do that work. But trying to concretize that into funded work with outcomes is the best way to move from theory and talk into action, I think.
Okay, that's appreciated. And just a couple of questions in the chat here. In terms of key messages for awareness raising and education, in your opinion, Brian, what are the most important things that open source developers or maintainers and customers of software, users of the software, need to know? So in terms of key messages around awareness raising and education, what are those key messages?
Sure. Let's see. Focusing first on the consumers of open source software, who tend to be other developers, right? You don't have somebody sitting on a phone going, "Am I going to choose open source or not?" They just get what they get from their app store, or from the websites that they go and visit. For those, outer edge of the onion developers, the important thing is to not assume that just because a project has a large number of GitHub stars that it's secure. To look for those characteristics, that a lot of the things that I mentioned here, a lot of things that you can see in the OpenSSF website, as whether it's the best practices badge or the security scorecard report, or other kinds of security hygiene. Like, look for these kinds of things, and if they're not present, kind of ask why they're not present. And if you are a developer, a maintainer, look, it can feel like bureaucracy to fill out the questionnaire that is the key to the best practices badge. It can feel like laborious scrutiny to have the scorecard running against your site and throwing up red flags for things it didn't find that are actually there, and so you have to adjust things to make it discoverable. It can feel like work without direct impact because it's not about adding features or immediately fixing bugs, but it is about helping build trust and confidence in your project. And you got to believe that as an industry, if we do this better, that will be better suited to be acceptable as core infrastructure for what society needs going forward.
Thanks very much. I think we've come to the end of the questions. I hope I've asked everyone's question. Brian, you're bang on time. Thank you so much for the conversation today. It's been really interesting to hear more. The video of this conversation will be available in the next few days, and I hope that we will be engaging with you in the next few weeks to organize our content for September. Thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, everyone.